Great, I'm hoping you can see that and hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, so today I'm going to be talking to you guys about spatial autonomous soundscape recording. So mono-channel, omnidirectional autonomous recorders, but also we'll move into spatial stuff towards the end of the talk. The research that I'm going to present today is largely mine, but I'm also going to talk to you about some of the other stuff that's been happening in our lab that I think you will find interesting or we'll have good discussion about. So brief overview of the whole talk. I'm going to start off by talking about autonomous recording, what it is and why I think it's important, giving you a bit of a case study of the site that we work in, as well as some of the problems that come with data management when you're handling data of this kind of volume. Then we'll move more into the spatial acoustics side of stuff. So I'll explain a little bit about what that is and how we record it, how we use it, how we analyze it, etc., and a little bit where I'm at with that. So the second half of this is going to be a much more sort of work in progress kind of piece of research. It's definitely not done yet, but I think, yeah, it's a good opportunity for collaboration and discussion, I think. So to start off, and this ties into a lot of what we were discussing in the last discussion period, to do with sampling design and recorder type and stuff. And when we think of acoustic recorders such as audio morphs or song meters, what you have is sort of a computer, a controlling element of the device, and then a microphone. And what you're able to do is plonk that device out in the forest or out in a grassland, wherever you're trying to record, and it will record data until either the battery runs out or the SD card fills up. And as you're well aware, this kind of recording is really useful. We're able to get loads of really good data out of that. Lots of really great studies have been done that have been very insightful into the kinds of things that are going on in ecosystems. One problem with that is it does still necessitate people going back to the forest and say either grabbing these devices to replace the batteries, replace the SD cards. Perhaps you're thinking about downsampling, so only sampling in mornings or only sampling at night to kind of like maximize its time in situ. But actually we found that there is an option around that, and that is to creating a device that is in itself autonomous. Now, the first and probably most obvious part of this is to attach a power source that's autonomous. So here what we've done, or how our recorders work, is that we have a solar panel, a deep cycle battery, and a solar charge controller. That basically means once out in the field, that device is going to be continually charging and discharging and can go indefinitely, provided you choose the right sort of conditions for the environment you're in. And the second part of that is how we actually access that data. And simply we are able, using these devices, to transmit audio over the same mobile networks that our phones use. So these devices can be placed anywhere in situ, and generally, depending on the kind of power requirements, the device itself costs in the region of £250. All of it is open source. The code base is open source. All of the instructions for building it are completely open source. And the only continual cost that you have on top of that is the cost of the mobile network that transmits the data. Depending on the type of data you use, that can be in the region of like £20 to £30 a month per recorder, which is quite a cheap alternative, I think. So yeah, one of the benefits of using these kinds of devices is it's much less labor intensive. You essentially go to the field once, you place it, and then it can go for as long as it can until, I don't know, elephants or monkeys find it and it doesn't quite survive that battle. The other thing is you're able to passively generate huge amounts of data that you can then analyze from the comfort of your own home. This data comes in at almost real time. I think depending on the data type, we have a lag of about 20 minutes, maybe an hour. And it lends well to standardized global data sets. We were talking a lot in the break about protocol and study design and stuff like that. And with a device like this, where you're not limited by the capacity of storage cards, you can record 24 hours of the day without having to worry about those cards filling up. Additionally, with it by default transmitting to a cloud storage location, I could share this data with anyone in this chat just by sending them a link and making them able to access it. So this platform is actually very beneficial for the kinds of problems that we were talking about earlier on. So the case study, or the sort of first deployment of this, was done at SAFE, which, if you're not familiar, is a big rainforest research facility in Malaysian Borneo. And the aim of SAFE is basically a large part of this area is going to be converted into palm oil. And these recorders were set up so that they can track in almost real time what the effect of that palm oil is having on the acoustic community. So this is actually a web platform. I've left the website up here. You're more than welcome to go have a look, where you can listen to rainforest recordings from the recorders designed by my colleague Sarab in almost real time. So yeah, just thought I'd throw in some pictures of what SAFE looks like on the ground. And yeah, so this platform, if you want to explore, is there, but obviously there is some more scientific purposes to having this data as well. As I'm sure you know, there are two main routes the way I see it, of analysing ecological data. The first, ecoacoustic data. The first is to look for individual species. So whether you have trained experts listening to the audio, or whether you train some kind of classification algorithm, you can look for individual species or groups of species. The other is to quantify the whole soundscape using generalized statistics or descriptive numbers, I guess. So that includes like the anthropophony, the human-made noise, the geophony, so like the natural non-animal noise, and then of course all the animal noise. So soundscapes are often, so that whole soundscape stuff is often quantified using indexes. And so one way of talking about the different types of indexes is I like to think of the more sort of traditional type maybe as analytical indices. So these are things that talk about, say, spread of frequencies, acoustic complexity indexes, those sort of custom built indexes that are designed to pull out certain features of the soundscape akin to biodiversity or ecologically rich environments. So those are a group of indices I like to call analytical indices. And the second, and the one that was first used for this purpose, to my knowledge, by Sarab, who was also in our group, was the use of convolutional neural net derived soundscape fingerprinting. And in short, what that is Google developed this big convolutional neural net that could classify sounds. So it would label the sounds with these big long feature sets, and then could classify the sounds based off of that number. So you would run the audio through the neural net, get out this number, and then use that number as a means of classification. But what Sarab did was actually just use that number as a means of training models to describe these environments, and predictive models to do a bunch of fancy investigation. Now, I won't talk about this too much because, as I said, this is Sarab's work, but just as an idea of the kind of application of this stuff, those audio set, we call it those audio set features, we were able to pull out temporal patterns, spatial patterns. So this is tracking how the soundscape changes over the course of a year. Also, that he was able to build an anomaly detection system whereby you would have this kind of like base sounds of a ecosystem, and then if something anomalous such as a chainsaw was present, it would like flag that up as an anomalous sound source. And then also it was able to so we were able to train the data set on species presence or absence, and that then show it data that it hadn't seen before, and it was able to predict with pretty great accuracy whether or not a particular species was present without ever being explicitly told what that species sounded like. So this stuff is quite powerful, we think, and it definitely has a lot of application. So one problem with having an autonomous recorder that just sits out in the forest gathering data forever is that you quickly build up huge amounts of data, and this end up having thousands of hours and terabytes upon terabytes of data on remote sources. So people tend to do things to try and like reduce their data, the size of their data. So that can be things like using compression, or it can be things like temporal downsampling. And this was just to show you what compression looks like. So the top one is a raw cicada call, and the bottom one is a quite highly compressed cicada call. One of the first things I did in my PhD was to just look at whether that kind of temporal downsampling and compression was having an effect on the conclusions we were able to draw, both normal analytical indices and the fingerprint, looking at impact on the numbers themselves and how well they could build models. This is all in a paper but basically found that audio set was able to continuously outperform the traditional analytical indices, and also it was way more robust to things like compression and temporal downsampling. And we were able to provide some nice guidelines out of that. So that was kind of all of the mono-channel stuff that we've been doing, or a little brief tour of the mono-channel stuff we've been doing. But the sort of latter half of my PhD, and what I would also here to talk to you about today, is about spatial acoustics. So that's how we can spatialize sound and get not only presence absence or summary statistics about the data, but more also positional information about where that sound's actually coming from. So when we're out in the forest and we hear, for example, a bird, without really consciously thinking about it, we're able to place in space where that bird is coming from, whether it's like, you know, up here or whether it's down below. And that's to do with the sound as it reaches each of our ears. So as it reaches each of our ears, it's going to hit one ear at one time, one ear at another, and also it might be louder or slightly different at either ear depending on whereabouts it is. And what we can find is if it hits one of our ears before the other one, it's likely that it's closer to that ear. Similarly, if it's slightly louder at one ear as opposed to the other, again, it's more likely that it's closer to the ear that it's louder in than the other. So we sort of are subconsciously spatializing sound all the time. And using similar principles, we can do the same things with multiple microphones at known points in space. So these same principles can be applied to that. If we imagine it slightly more as a sound wave would be, if we imagine this was just say like a sine wave, what that would look like is that there would be a lag in recorder one before the sound actually reached it. And as I was saying, when you know what that time difference is based on the speed of sound and stuff, you can place where it is likely that that sound has come from. But what you can also do is you can take that lag and you can sort of shift that time a little bit and line up the signals. So what you now have is the same signal recorded from two different microphones, but lined up so that they correlate together. And what we find we can do is we can add those signals together to create a signal where the peaks match up and the troughs match up. And so what you get is actually an amplified signal. What's the cool thing about this as well is that noise is often uncorrelated. So this time lag sort of beamforms or amplifies signals from a certain direction in the sound field, but noise, say, is more diffuse and is actually deconstructively added up. So by using sort of spatial acoustics and more than one microphone, we're not only able to pull out positional information, but we're allowed to amplify the signal to noise ratio by doing this kind of beamforming process. And this is just a more visual idea of what that looks like. So you take a system like this where there's a lot going on, say a rainforest or another very busy forest system, and you can pull out where a sound is coming from, but also sort of dull the sounds that you're not looking for, or that sounds in the area that you aren't after investigating. So this is all well and good, but I guess the big question is, well, how does this apply to ecology? Why is this important, and what can we do with it? And there are a number of uses. So one is that we can look at the position and the movement of animals, and particularly things like habitat use and whether there are like territories that are being defended or whether certain areas of a forest are being used more than others. One thing that I find particularly interesting and I'm hoping to explore is the use of height in a forest, whether certain species of bird will behave differently or like call from different heights depending on the forest type or depending on different ecosystem pressures. An additional thing is that when you have, say, for example, a recording of from an omnidirectional microphone where you've got, say, like 20 different tones or calls, it's impossible to tell whether that's one bird calling 20 times or whether it's 20 birds calling one time. But when you have positional information, you can start to pick out, okay, there's one there and there's one here, and you can get a bit more of an idea about abundance. Also, similarly, looking at co-occurrence of different species and seeing the species interactions. And again, as I was saying, reducing background noise and subsetting data to focus on just the signal that you're looking for. So this is kind of the relevance of stuff. So there's two main ways of doing spatial acoustics. One is to do hyperbolic, which is where you have a matrix of recorders and your sound source comes within that matrix. And from that, you can get a good geographical position of where that organism actually is, which is quite good for, say, territory stuff and looking at interactions. One sort of holdback of that is that you need to know very accurately where your microphones are, where they're all positioned. And in forest types that I usually work in, they're usually very hilly, very dense. You're reliant a lot on the trees that are actually present, and you know, the trees occasionally, I don't know, may move, or there are some issues and complications with doing that. So you can also have a look at direction of arrival. So you'll get a less accurate specific position, but what you are able to do is have a single unit that you can deploy and then spatialize and understand sounds based off of that. So that's the route I've chosen to go down. And my kind of project was to take the system that exists already, that autonomous recorder that I mentioned at the start, and attach a multi-channel element to it. And there's a lot of ways of doing that as well. So these are two ends of the spectrum, I would say, in terms of multi-channel recorder. The top one is an ambisonics microphone, and that's, I'm not sure if you'd have seen it, I think I put a picture in earlier, but it's the kind of tetrahedral shaped microphone. So it's all in a point and an orb, and that will spatialize sounds or record sounds in 3D that you can then spatialize with ambisonics. This one that I've got here costs in the region of £1,000. So I think someone might have their microphone on. Yeah. So that one costs in the region of £1,000. The one below is the ReSpeaker hat, which conveniently is also it works well with a Raspberry Pi. So what this is a six microphone array, which you can see the little microphones and the little gold squares there. That sits on top of a Raspberry Pi. Based on the kind of thing that you're trying to do with your study, you can look at which one of these is most appropriate. For me, keeping things open source and keeping things cheap and keeping them available for people to be like, okay, I'd quite like to try that and do their own thing with, particularly on a budget, was important to me. So after some consideration, I decided that going with this circular array would be the best option. One of the costs of using a circular array rather than a 3D one is that you do lose a bit of the 3D based positioning, but what we can do is still spatialize in 2 dimensions. So again, we're looking, when you come to design a recorder like this, it's considering things like natural resources, whether there's enough sunlight, what the tree attachment situation is like, what your aim is with the product, if it's going to be something that's open source and easy and cheap for people to use, or whether you want to go for a more high-end, super accurate recorder. And again, also looking at what the hopeful outcomes of that study are. So again, as I said, this is very, very in progress work, so please don't tweet about it too much. But so I decided to go for the 6-channel circular array, and that's something that I've been building and testing over the last year or so. I thought, well, perhaps naively, I hoped it would be a case of you just being able to switch one out and plug a new one in. But actually, it can be quite complicated when you're doing this kind of spatialization studies. One important thing being is that you need to make sure that the microphones are taking samples at as close to exactly the right time as possible. And that takes quite complicated time syncing between the devices, which you can overcome with specific sound cards. But then also we're looking at enormous types of data. Also, you're no longer able to use lossy compression because, again, these signals need to be as standardized as possible. Well, there was some software rejigs I had to do, some hardware rejigs I had to do, but overall it's ended up working quite well. But one of the big changes that we've made was in the single channel recorder, we were able to use the solar panel that we have as a kind of shield, like an overhead shield, and then the microphone would just sit underneath. With spatializing sound, you kind of want that sound field to be as uninterrupted as possible. So I used a bit more of, I would say, maybe an invasive kind of waterproofing technique. So something that was directly between that microphone and the sound field, and that was these ePTFE vents. the biggest question I had was wondering whether how much that's going to affect the sound and the content of the sound. So I've been in the stage of lab testing. So this, what I have on the right, is the two signals that I played are in different positions around the device. So we have a sweep signal and then either pink noise or Eurasian wren. And what I found was actually that the waterproofing had an effect. There was some loss in frequency, particularly at higher frequencies, which was expected. But overall, the signal is still largely maintained between the two across most frequencies. Similarly, the localization accuracy, so how well that signal could be localized, was maintained to within 5 degrees for both the waterproofed and non-waterproof devices. So lab testing all seems to be, or have gone well. Over this summer, well, last summer, I guess now, I put some recorders out in the forest. So you can see on the right, this is what it looks like. With those little white stickers there are the EPTF events. And I'm in the process now of quality testing and en masse analyzing this data to see what kind of signals we can pull out and what kind of height dynamics we're getting. I've got over 3,500 hours of 6-channel acoustic data. And yeah, as I said, I'm in the process of quality testing now. We had some hiccups in switching from recording on like a site that has good connectivity to bad connectivity. But yeah, this is kind of the field testing process that I am in now. As I said, this is all very much a work in progress. So if you have any ideas or want to know more, the best ways to sort of keep up to date with this research is either to follow me on Twitter, that's my handle. You're more than welcome to drop me an email if you'd like some more information or you have any ideas you'd like to speak about, or we have the Audio Experience Design website, which is the group that I'm part of, where we'll be posting all sorts of updates about mine and other work within the group. Yep, this is a list of references that I used throughout the presentation. I don't know if you want to screenshot it, but if not, I can send it to you. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Becky. That was great. I can see some applause in the audience. And, so now, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand, or you can ask in the chat if you're not able to turn on your microphone. I see Andrea Thibault has a question. Do you want to ask your question aloud, or you prefer that I read it?
Yes, either way. I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering how using the system that allows to assess the direction from where the sound is coming from, is there a way to also estimate the distance? And I have in mind, yeah, well, the way I would use it is to see if the animal is moving closer or moving away from the recorders. So yeah, that was my question.
No, thank you. So the way that I've been thinking about it, or my motivations for this have been, as I mentioned, using that high occupancy stuff where by distance to the recorder isn't, for me, it's not super where I've been researching or where I've been looking. I imagine that by using some sort of level comparisons, you'd be able to get an approximation of how far away the signal was. Also, if the signal moves past the microphone or the array, the analyzing software that I've been using, at least in my preliminary test, is able to track signals. So if it does come towards the array and move past it, you will see it pass by. But in terms of finding out an absolute distance, I'm not completely sure how you do that, but I would imagine it would be possible by looking at the level or the loudness of that signal.
Okay, thank you very much.
Next, David Savage, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah. Hi.
Okay.
Once you get these out in the field and they're going to start to deal with all the kinds of things that nature's going to be throwing at them, how much is differential rates of microphone degradation going to throw off any of your estimates of position?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and that's what I've been working on primarily over the last few months, has been writing scripts that can detect basically exactly what you're talking about. So one of the problems we have found, which has been interesting, is that non-uniformly across the recorders. So I've got one recorder that's working almost perfectly, and then there's another one where I just was getting like drops in the channels. So for example, some of the channels would just drop out, and part of me is I wonder if it was maybe a connection issue to the batteries. As I say, this is all in quite early stage testing. But yeah, so I've been writing a script that can detect when we've got a dead channel, and then also by using comparisons of the content of the signal, the loudness of the signal, and the kind of spread of frequencies, I'm comparing, it can compare across those 6 channels if there's an abnormality. So if there's an anomaly, say for example, a microphone that's degraded more than the others and isn't picking up as high frequencies as the others anymore, that will get flagged as, okay, we've got an anomalous channel in this recording. So yeah, that is a very good question, and that is something that I've been working on recently.
Thanks. So next we have Paulo from Twitter. I don't know if you want to ask a question with turn on the microphone, or I should just read it. Maybe I'll reading it. So the distance between microphones is quite small. Does the time difference of arrival must be short? What ADC, I'm not sure what ADC stands for, frequency are you using? Is the system very sensitive to uncertainties related to sound reflection and possible interference as well as SNR?
So yeah, so the distance between the microphones is quite small, and I think the theory kind of says that when you have those small distances, you sort of lose accuracy in terms of where you're able to place that signal, or just differentiate between different points around the recorder itself. I'm unsure what ADC frequency means, but if you mean the sampling frequency, we're at 16,000 hertz, so 16 kilohertz, which isn't huge actually. That was kind of necessitated by the microphone array. I think, given the option to design one myself, I would have liked to have gone a little bit higher. But yeah, for like the lab testing I've done, I found that it was the microphone array I used was able to do quite well in terms of sound reflections and interference. When we come to analyze the audio, at the minute I'm using Harkbird, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but it's almost like a click and play software thing where you are able to analyze spatial audio, and it will give you the spatialized and extracted signals as well as some positional information. From that, you're able to set thresholds, and I found that if I manually set the threshold, I can make sure that I'm capturing just the signal. If the signal is too low, I have found that you do get some like reflections and some echoes, particularly on the lab test I was doing. But that is one of the challenges, is that looking at the field data, which is what I've been doing sort of recently, it's quite difficult to standardize the threshold because it does seem to change in terms of weather conditions and general like recorder type, forest type and stuff like that. So it's a process that I've started, but yeah, it's definitely not completely there yet. So
one more good question, and then you feel free to answer in the chat.
okay, sure.
If you want to ask,
or maybe there's a question after mine.
okay, we can take the Sven Batik is asking whether it's possible to apply Raspberry Pi system, the same system you're using, to autonomous recordings in aquatic habitat.
Sure. So the recorder that I use, so the vents that I use, I ordered, I got especially made, and they are allegedly supposed to, they're like iPro 64 or something. I don't remember exactly, but I think it was the one they were able to be underwater by a meter for 4 hours or something like that. I would say that if you're looking to do like saltwater submersions, or at least deeper submersions than 1 meter, then probably different kinds of waterproofing would be necessary. I'm unsure how the microphones themselves would interact with the water. I'm not sure exactly how hydrophones work, but if you are, I mean, the recording software that we have on board the Raspberry Pi basically allows you to add different sensors to it. The multi-channel stuff got a little bit complicated because, as I mentioned, with the sound card and the compression method kind of threw things off a little bit. But if you had a hydrophone that you could attach to a Raspberry Pi, and you can design the Raspberry Pi to sample when you want, for how long you want, and it will upload all that data in the exact same way. The Raspberry Pi system itself, or the way that it was designed, is basically just a sensor system that can autonomously charge and send data for cloud storage. So that's all available on the GitHub, and if you look up the papers, I think it'll all be linked. It'll all be linked there.